make a start. I did think about changing my jacket so that you might think it wasn't the same person who'd already given a couple of presentations, and you'd have think you might have a fresh face, or at least my twin speaking. But twins actually is one of the few things we don't have to worry about in age verification. They really struggle in the world of digital identity on twins, but fortunately they tend to share the same birth date, which makes life a lot easier. So in my capacity as the chair of the IEEE's working group for a standard catchily known as 2089.1, the standard for online age verification, I'm just going to give you a little bit of awareness of a standard that we've been working on for a couple of years now, which was actually approved by IEEE's board just about 10 days ago. So it's hot off the press. It's currently being prepared for publication, and you'll be able to buy a copy of the standard from all your all good local bookshops that stock international standards, or alternatively, I'm pretty sure you can buy it online from IEEE. So just keep in mind that obviously the content is now IEEE's copyright. But a little bit of history and the objectives of this standard. Obviously, we did have since 2018 the PAS, the British Standard 1296. Which it was a great foundation for creating a new industry. But as somebody whose job, with my hat on as the chairman of the chairman's here, the executive director of the trade association, of going around persuading people that we are a modern and well-organized industry, referring to standards is very helpful, but referring to one which is 6 years old in a world that moves as fast as technology does, not least age verification technology, which has moved even faster perhaps than the average. 2018 seems like a light years ago. So we wanted something that was more up to date. So we can now talk about a 2024 standard. We engaged with the IEEE to do this because the Five Rights Foundation had at that time just about finished their own standard for age appropriate design, which was a standard to complement GDPR and the UK's Children's Code, or the Age Appropriate Design Code. And we, working with Five Rights, they suggested it would be helpful if the next in that family of standards addressed age assurance. At the time, of course, we were calling it age verification. So we're a little bit behind the times, and once you've agreed the scope of these projects and their titles, there's a lot of bureaucracy if you want to change it. So we've stuck to age verification. Now, the scope of the EU consent project, the interoperability project I was talking about this morning, also included drafting some initial standards for use in future. So we had a good starting point. And the objective, just to remind you, of standards generally in this area is particularly to create a common language, so that when legislatures are passing laws, or their regulators are defining the detailed regulations, or when companies are trying to buy solutions, or even just set up the requirements for their design teams to build their own solutions, they're all talking a similar language. And standards are also the basis of audit and certification, so that we can know that people are doing age verification to an appropriate standard. And I think we're going to see that becomes increasingly important, particularly in the US market, where we now have active age verification laws, which have even survived appeals court decisions on their constitutionality. But all of them tend to say that you cannot retain any personal data. So when you're being sued in a US court, you won't be able to just say, well, hang on, here's a copy of the passport that was faxed through to me to prove that little Johnny was old enough to access my adult-only site. Because you won't be allowed to keep that copy of that passport, and that in itself will be a finable offence. So you're going to need something else to show the judge to demonstrate that you did good quality age verification to prevent children coming onto your site. And what better than a certificate showing that you have been audited as delivering age assurance in compliance with a recognised international standard. The standard can also help us design an approach to measuring accuracy, which, as we will go into today, is not quite as simple as saying, well, how often are you right or how often are you wrong? We can do a little bit better than that in defining levels of accuracy. And of course, it facilitates reuse and interoperability, because if everybody's doing things to the same standard, then you can use a check over and over again, and you can share it across different platforms. So who was helpful in putting this together? A big thank you to everybody you see up on the screen We should really describe these as affiliated organisations or affiliations rather than employers. One of the rules is you don't speak on behalf of your employer when you're creating standards. You speak in your own right, but obviously benefiting normally from what you've learned through your day job. And you'll see that, Alistair, who's here, age checked and chair of the AVPA, was part of that, and also Duncan McCann from the Five Rights Foundation. So we had that connection. Tony Allen, our host today, was also sitting on this group. Looking across to the observers, you'll also see that we had some UK regulators, the ICO and Ofcom. They came in partway through the process, but it was great because this was an indication that regulators were seeing the potential benefits of international standards. And I believe those regulators are also observers on the development of the ISO standards. So we had a good group of people who worked on this. One of the reasons we went with the IEEE was we thought it would also be a lot quicker to write something than the ISO. That was perhaps a little bit optimistic on my part, but also there are a few moving parts going on. So at some points we just slightly paused the process to allow other research to catch up so that we were delivering the best product. So the scope of the standard is formally described as establishing a framework for the design, specification, evaluation and deployment of age verification systems. And as I said, we used age verification in the title, but in the content of the standard, you can see that it extends to include age estimation under the broad category of age assurance. And we look at obviously defining those terms, defining the levels of confidence, which are sort of derivations of work that was published by the ICO and Ofcom, and also, of course, reassuring people around privacy protections and data security. What we didn't get into was countermeasures, so sort of anti-spoofing techniques and methods to check the overall level of security. There are plenty of other standards that cover those sort of things. We didn't need to repeat what was in other standards, which is a fundamental sort of approach rule when you're writing standards. So the standard provides a set of processes. So in this is how I would distinguish it from the work that's going on next door with the ISO. This was really a very much a step-by-step guide to best practice process of how do if I sit down and I want to implement an age assurance system, what do I do? What are the steps? And we go through step by step, helping people to understand how to do that. Just picking up on the definitions, you shouldn't see anything there which is in any way contradictory. I mean, these with any of the other standards. So these are now sort of accepted definitions in the industry. The only thing I would say is in the US, we are still tending to use age verification as the general term. And you might then see facial age estimation as a method within age verification, because it can still allow you to get a very strong indication of somebody's age, particularly if you are testing for an age well above the legal minimum, for example. So I often find myself having to slightly switch language when I'm in the US and talk about age verification, but in my mind, knowing that within that, I also include age estimation. This is obviously always going to be a problem with a young industry where different people are interpreting terms slightly differently. But we do hope the standards will deliver some common understanding of how we want to use each of these terms. In terms of the processes which we then go to, which is where the real detail is found in the standard, and as I say, you'll need to buy it if you want to get that detail. I'm not on commission, I hasten to point out, so I don't think I get anything. I don't think I do, Moira, do I? I don't get, there's no commission for the author? No. Yeah. So anyway, so the process overview, we have the step-by-step 4 processes of determination, selection, assurance, and categorization, and then underpinning the whole process, privacy, data security, and interoperability. So just to sort of talk about the processes in a little bit more detail, I think the one we had the most debate about was determination, because there's a sort of a default approach in standards bodies to want to produce standards that comply with legislation. Now, the problem we've got is we have a very, very mixed bag of legislation. It's popping up all over the place. It's not consistent. There's a bit of a chicken and egg problem. If we'd had the standard, hopefully the legislation would have aligned with the standard. But at the moment, the legislation is leading in some places and might conflict. IEEE kindly, as part of their contribution, provide probably very expensive lawyers to help us with this problem. And so the compromise we agreed on, and I think this came up in the earlier presentation around the object of certification, was as part of that scoping exercise to be really clear about what age verification is being certified and where it is intended to operate. So you would say at the outset of some sort of audit, we are being certified for our age verification, which will operate in the European Union, the United Kingdom, and Florida. And it would need, therefore, to be compliant with the laws in those states. But it wouldn't necessarily mean that you were claiming you were compliant with California's law or Texas's law. And so that's going to be a really important distinction when people come to use this standard, because anybody, I think, today who claims that they've implemented age verification, which is compliant on a global basis with every single law that's ever been passed, I think is probably being over optimistic. Even if they are something as big as one of the global platforms, I think they'd still struggle to stay up to date and keep their tech updated fast enough to keep up with the law. So then, having figured out where you want to comply, that then drives how you comply, which is the selection process. So looking at which methods are appropriate for that particular jurisdiction, so will meet the standards required in those jurisdictions that you're complying in. And then obviously the process of doing the age check, so how that's conducted. And then finally categorizing the level of confidence, so the level of age assurance that's going to be associated with that particular method or methods, if you use a combination of methods to increase your level of confidence. And then obviously underpinning those processes, privacy, data security and interoperability. Interoperability sort of is a function of levels of confidence and obviously of certification. A lot more detail in the standard itself, but that gives you a general idea of how we've approached it. And I think will also allow you to, if you're looking at drafts of the ISO, which has a framework and then a particular one on benchmarking and then a third part, which is going to be on interoperability, you'll see it's quite different in the way that it looks at concepts, and we're looking at a best practice process. Within each of the processes, then we go through the purpose, the outcomes, the activities and tasks involved in that process, and what the inputs and outputs would be. And that would effectively become the checklist for an auditor who was going in to certify you as being compliant against each of these, against the standard, by looking at how you conduct each of those processes, some of which are obviously sort of one-off things when you're figuring out where you're going to be compliant, other things you're having to do with each and every check. We then have a go in the annex of trying to come up with some indicators of confidence, so sort of these levels of assurance. And we realized very quickly, as I said, it wasn't something it could just be as simple as false positive rate, how many times are you getting it right out of 100. We're actually interested not only how often you're wrong, but how wrong are you. So if a few 17-year-olds sneak through and manage to access an adult website, that may not be the end of the world. If your system is letting 5% of people underage through, but all of those 5% are under the age of 7, then you might be considerably more worried about the quality of the system that you're applying. So we're interested in the spread of the error. So also we want to know how often do we check age assurance. So it might be you log into an adult site and you have to complete a fresh check once a year. It might be that there is some error in the system, or somebody's found a way to get around your system, which we try not to let that happen, but it might happen. So at the very least, we want fresh checks on an annual basis, even at some of the lowest levels of assurance. What sort of counter fraud measures are in place? How do we check the authenticity of the user? So authenticating to make sure that if you're reusing a check that you've used before, that you're the same person who completed that check. And again, how frequently we authenticate you. So how often do we ask you to put in a PIN number or even do a biometric authentication to prove that you're still the right person who did the check previously? And then a final wrinkle which came in towards the end was some regulators still require a specific date of birth, even if they don't want to know your identity, but they want you to record the actual date of birth. So that was another option that people would have to consider. Can we just retain the fact that they're over 18, or do we need to be able to produce a list of dates of birth of the people who accessed our site? Now, I'm not going to try and go into the detail of this table, but essentially for each of those dimensions, there are various levels. And in order to reach a certain level of assurance, you have to achieve a minimum at each of those levels. So obviously for the highest levels of assurance, you would, for example, have to authenticate every time you use that age check. But for lower levels, you might not have to do it, and unless you do it perhaps on an annual basis. And if you lied about your age, asserted your age, then that's indefinite, because we don't need to ask you to lie again on a repeated basis, for example. And then on the accuracy of the outcome, and I'll spend a little bit more time, again, these are concepts which are sort of being developed in partnership with the UK regulators around setting a percentage limit of about how wrong can you be, and what percentage of the outcomes can be wrong, and how far off can they be, which is a really bad way of explaining it. So I've drawn some pictures. So here's an example of where you might be trying to check that somebody's 18, and obviously the resulting estimates might be either side of 18. So this shows them going down to a bit below 16 or estimating a bit above 20, even though, let's assume in this case, you're actually on your 18th birthday. And these are the errors. So what we're saying in the way we've defined this is that there's a narrow band where you, within a year, above or below the actual age, and we want, in this case of a standard level of assurance, to be confident that 95% of the results are no worse than a year wrong. So, you are no more or less than 1 year out. Now that would leave you with perhaps 5% either side of that acceptable boundary. But remember, only half of that is going to be the wrong side. Because if you're saying, are you over 18, and we estimate that you turn out to be 24, not 22, it doesn't really matter. You're still legally allowed to access the content. So we're only really worried about that bottom boundary. So, in this case, we're saying 2.5% of, kids under 17 are going to be able to get through that particular level. So if a regulator's comfortable with that, but they also might say, well, hang on, you're saying they're under 17, but how much under 17 are they? So that's where we have the wider limit. And this is where we're saying we want 99%, so nearly everybody, to be within 2 years of the correct age. And that means that your tail is only 0.5%. Now, at the higher levels of assurance, you might put that up to 99.5 or even 99.9% and really reduce what you're allowing to slip through. Keep in mind, in most of the real use cases for age assurance on the high street, for example, when we send test purchasers in to see whether shopkeepers check your age, a good score is 70%. So, we're debating in these standards whether we want 95 or 99 or 99.9, but we're already, massively raising the level of compliance by using, technical approaches to age verification rather than the human eye. And so that's how we've approached this idea of setting the level of accuracy. Authentication, as I mentioned, is just a question of how often do we ask you to prove who you are, and how and the extent of doing a liveness check as well. So we heard earlier about the Project Defy and the threat of deepfake and AI to all of these technologies. So clearly, for high levels of authentication, you want to be making sure you're talking to a real person, not just a very good avatar that is doing an impersonation of somebody. So just some concluding thoughts on what we did with this standard. It was a successful collaboration between competitors. On that list of affiliations were a number of companies that do fight pretty hard to get clients between each other, but they came together to agree this standard. The scope of certification is really important. It's impossible to comply in every jurisdiction. Designed to be a practical guide, so it complements the ISO 27566. A helpful reference when we're discussing age assurance publicly with regulators or lawmakers, and we can point to it saying, yes, we have thought about privacy and data security. We are taking a proportional approach. We're not having a one-size-fits-all age verification, and we are facilitating interoperability. So the next steps, the standard is with IEEE's publication team, and it will be published and available to purchase. With the 2089, there was a donation which allowed that to be made public domain. So if anybody fancies approaching me with a large check, we'd love to make this public domain, but it is a fairly expensive check, because obviously IEEE, the way they make their money is by selling standards, which I'm sure is common to all the other standards bodies. At the moment, you'll need to buy that. And then what we're looking at next is to create that ability to be audited and certified against it, perhaps by ACCS or another approved conformity assessment body, where you've heard about how UCAS works approving CABs. Well, in this case, IEEE would approve the conformity assessment body and allow them to issue certificates against this standard. So that was all I had prepared. Is there anything I can answer in terms of questions?
Thanks, Ian, for a great presentation. My name is Asfar. I am a PhD student in Montreal, Canada. So I was wondering about the error check in the other way around. For example, someone is 25, but we get them as 17. So do we take it as a serious error, or maybe it works? I mean, we are more concerned about the minor part.
Obviously, I think it's going to depend on the use case. So one thing I always like to remind people in this world is we started by saying, how do we prevent kids getting into places that are adult spaces only? Sometimes we also want to prevent adults getting into children's spaces, or at least be aware when there are adults in children's spaces, so that we can keep an eye on their behavior and make sure. There was an example, I think, of one global gaming platform where 2,000 adults were regularly interacting with 100,000 children online. And that wasn't because they had any nice, benevolent reason for doing so. They were nasty people who had found vulnerable children. So it works both ways. So sometimes you will worry just as much about people being wrong in the other direction as in the conventional direction.
Certainly. Thank you.
It's Mashilo once again from South Africa. I just want to know, Ian, because I think key to this is collaborative approach. And I want to know what has been the posture of civil society movement insofar as privacy is concerned, and how have you addressed that? And then the last thing on privacy, have you data? I think privacy. Have you considered maybe the limitations around? Because you just said about the information have to be securely stored, but in most cases for others it will be like there must be timelines as to how far you can secure that information so that it's not permanently stored. Otherwise, it goes beyond what it was originally stored for.
Thank you. So in terms of the involvement of civil society, I think primarily we relied on the Five Rights Foundation being involved and sitting on the working group, and they were very active. In fact, Baroness Kidron was particularly active in going through on her holiday with a red pen and making edits to every single page. I think obviously these standards need to be maintained, and I hope that in the next iteration we will have even more involvement in the working group than we had initially. Obviously we had experts who didn't have to go up a learning curve. We could get together and quickly come up with the answers here. In terms of data minimization, I have to be a little careful because I don't ever want to speak across any one provider's business model, because everybody has designed it in a slightly different way. But essentially, we require people to comply with GDPR, which is around data minimization. So only storing data you need to store and only sharing data you need to share. And by the way, when I share the fact that you are old enough, that's all I have to say. He's old enough. I don't have to say how much older he is or what his date of birth is. So that is part of data minimization. Not storing data is also critical here as well. So the only non-hackable database is no database at all. So please, for goodness sake, do not create databases full of children's faces and children's dates of birth and names and addresses. And please, please never do that. And I don't believe any of the trade association members do that either. They might, however, give you a reusable digital identity where you keep that information on your own device under your own control. So we've had to make sure the standard allows for that. But that's very different from keeping it in a central database where somebody else has access to your personal data. The time limits, really, in theory, you only need to see that image or access that digital identity for a couple of seconds to confirm the age. And then the only thing you really need to retain is perhaps a date of birth and a unique identifier for that user, which could be Mickey Mouse 123. It doesn't have to be anything identifying. And then that's enough for you as a verification provider to tell others in future whether somebody's old enough or young enough or in the correct age range. So that's the purest approach, but there will be different flavors of that. But fundamentally, everybody has to comply with GDPR. And while that's not a global law, certainly the standard is built around those same concepts of compliance with that sort of law. Great. Any more questions? If not, I'll say thank you very much. And that's me done for the day. You will not see me again today, you'll be pleased to hear.